I never thought that owning a piece of land could turn into a battle zone. For years my ranch was my safe haven. A wide stretch of open fields, rolling hills, and fresh air that felt like freedom in every breath. I had worked for this place for decades. From a single rented office in town to buying the whole ranch complex piece by piece until it was mine. Every barn, every shed, every square foot of the office building was in my name. I had the deeds locked away in my safe. I had the tax receipts and the official stamps to prove it. But apparently proof did not matter to the people who called themselves the HOA. It started on a Monday morning when I was sitting in my office. The office building on my ranch was not just a room with a desk. It was a solid 2-story structure built from cedar wood with big windows facing the sunrise. I had renovated it myself with the help of a few friends from the construction trade. This was where I ran all my operations. Paperwork, meetings, storage for ranch equipment. It was the nerve center of everything I owned. So when I heard tires crunching on my driveway that morning, I assumed it was a delivery truck or maybe a supplier bringing feed for the horses. I stood up, looked out the window, and froze. There were 3 cars in my driveway. Not ranch trucks, not delivery vans. These were shiny SUVs with magnetic signs on the side. Homeowners Association Security. And behind them a sedan I did not recognize. For people got out all wearing polo shirts with the HOA logo. They had clipboards, walkie-talkies, and the kind of fake smile people wear when they think they are in charge. The one in front was a woman in her 50s. Short hair, sharp eyes, and a voice that could slice glass. I recognized her from the few times I had been in town. Her name was Karen. And she had a reputation for making other people's business her business. Karen called out to me before she even reached the steps. She said they were here to perform an inspection of my office. She claimed the HOA had received reports that I was using the property for commercial purposes not approved under community guidelines. I almost laughed right there on the porch. Commercial purposes. This was a working ranch. Everything here was commercial in one way or another. But more importantly, I was not under any HOA. The ranch was private property bought outright before the nearby subdivision even existed. I told her as much. I said this property is mine, the office is mine, and the HOA has no authority here. She did not even blink. Instead, she told me they had jurisdiction over all buildings within a certain boundary. And according to their map, my office fell inside that line. I told her map was wrong. She told me they would decide that. The other HOA members began walking around my building, writing notes and taking pictures. I stepped down from the porch and told them to leave immediately. That was when Karen pulled out her phone and said if I did not comply they would call 911. Now I do not scare easy. But I also know what happens when you get the police involved. It does not matter who is right at first. The moment someone calls 911 you are in for a day of stress. But I also knew I had every legal right to stand my ground. So I crossed my arms and told her to go ahead and make the call. She did. She spoke loudly enough for me to hear every word. She told the dispatcher that I was refusing to allow an HOA inspection. That I was being hostile. That she feared for the safety of her members. I could not believe the lies coming out of her mouth. Within minutes I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. My mind raced. This was insane. I had never had trouble with the law in my life. And now I was about to have police show up at my office because some power-hungry HOA president decided to play sheriff. I went inside, grabbed my folder of property documents, and came back out to wait. If the police wanted to hear the truth, I was ready to give it to them. The HOA members kept circling my office like vultures. Taking pictures of every door, every window, every inch of siding. One of them even crouched down to photograph the foundation. I told them again to get off my land, but they acted like I was invisible. Karen stood in the middle of the driveway looking smug. She really thought she was about to win something here. The sirens grew louder until 2 patrol cars pulled up beside the HOA vehicles. The officers stepped out, scanning the scene with that careful professional look they always have. One of them asked me to step forward. The other went to talk to Karen. She immediately started spinning her story about how the HOA had full authority over this property and how I was obstructing them. I could see the officer's eyebrow twitch as she talked. He asked her a few questions, then walked over to me. I handed him my folder and told him everything. How I had purchased the ranch before the subdivision existed. How the office building was part of my operations and completely outside HOA jurisdiction. How I had legal proof right in his hands. He flipped through the papers slowly. I could tell he was reading the dates and matching them to the official stamps. When he looked back up at me, there was a different expression in his eyes. A hint of understanding and maybe even respect. Meanwhile, Karen was still talking loudly to the second officer. She kept pointing at the office building like it was some forbidden structure. The officer with my papers finally walked over to her and I followed. He held up the deeds and told her plainly, "Ma'am, this property is not under your HOA. You have no authority here." Karen's face went pale then flushed red. She tried to argue saying their boundary map showed otherwise, but the officer shut her down. He told her the county records were the only authority in this matter and those records were clear. You could feel the air change right then. The HOA members started shifting uncomfortably. A couple of them avoided eye contact and began heading back to their SUVs. Karen, however, was not ready to give up. She accused me of forging documents. She said she would take this to court. The officer told her she was free to do that, but in the meantime she and her people needed to leave my property immediately. She glared at me as if I had stolen something from her. Then she turned on her heel and stomped toward her car. The others followed. Engines started one by one until the driveway was clear except for the patrol cars. The officers gave me a nod. One of them even said, "Nice place you have here, sir." I thanked them and watched them drive away. But deep down I knew this was not over. Karen had the look of someone who would not let go easily. And if she was willing to call 911 once, she might try something worse next time. I went back into my office, sat down at my desk and stared out the window. The piece of the ranch felt fragile now. Like one wrong move could shatter it. I decided then and there that I was going to prepare for whatever came next. Because if Karen wanted a fight over this office, she was going to find out just how much I was willing to defend what was mine. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Out here on the ranch you get used to the natural sounds. The wind pushing through the tall grass. The creak of the barn door. The distant call of cattle moving across the pasture. But now I noticed every sound differently. Every car engine passing on the distant road. Every crunch of tires on gravel near the gate. I knew Karen was not done. I could feel it in my gut. People like her do not just walk away when they think they lost. They circle back with a new plan and twice the determination. By Wednesday I decided to take action before she did. I called my lawyer Tom. Tom had been with me through more than one land dispute over the years. He was calm, sharp, and had a way of reading the law like it was a simple instruction manual. I explained what had happened with the HOA. He listened without interrupting, then said something that stuck in my head. He told me the first mistake people make in situations like this is assuming the other side will play fair. If Karen thought she had any angle to claim control over my property, she would use it. And she would use every trick available to wear me down. He told me to expect paper threats, official-looking letters, and maybe even more visits with local authorities in tow. Tom suggested I document everything. He told me to set up cameras around the office and main entrances. Not just for security but for evidence if this ever went to court. I did exactly that. By Friday morning I had 4 high-definition cameras running. One watching the driveway. One on the porch. One covering the back of the office. And one inside above the main desk. They were connected to a system that stored footage automatically. I was ready. But readiness is one thing. Peace of mind is another. That Friday afternoon as I was finishing up inventory paperwork, I heard it again. The sound of tires crunching over my gravel driveway. I looked out the window and my stomach tightened. It was the same HOA SUVs. But this time there were more of them. 5 vehicles in total. And trailing behind them was a white county truck with an official seal on the door. I stepped out onto the porch. The sun was high and the heat was rolling in waves across the fields. Karen was there again. Her eyes locked on me like a hawk spotting prey. Beside her was a man in a county uniform holding a clipboard. They walked up together while the other HOA members fanned out across the driveway. The man introduced himself as a county code enforcement officer. He said he had been called to investigate a complaint regarding unapproved modifications to a commercial structure. Right away I knew the game. Karen had escalated. She could not get me with HOA rules, so she was trying to use county code. I told the officer I had made no unapproved modifications. I explained the building was inspected and approved when I renovated it years ago. He nodded but said he was required to perform a visual inspection to verify compliance. Now I am no fool. I know my rights. I asked him plainly if he had a warrant. He admitted he did not. I told him politely but firmly that without one he could not enter the building. Karen jumped in immediately, accusing me of hiding violations. She said I was refusing because I knew I had broken the law. The officer held up a hand and told her to let him speak. He explained that while he could not force entry without a warrant, he could still file a report noting my refusal. Karen smiled at that like it was a victory. But I could see the officer was not on her side. He said the report would simply state that no inspection was conducted due to property owner refusal and that any further action would require legal steps. In other words, he was following the book and nothing more. Karen did not like that answer. She started pacing the porch, spouting off about how community standards were falling apart and how people like me were ruining the neighborhood. I let her talk. Sometimes silence is the best weapon. Eventually she stomped back toward her SUV and barked orders at her group to take more pictures. That was when I decided I had had enough of the performance. I told her in a steady voice that she and her crew were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She tried to argue again. But this time I pointed to the cameras mounted on the office corners and told her everything was being recorded. Every step she took, every word she said, and that I was ready to hand it over to my lawyer. For the first time I saw hesitation in her eyes. She glanced at the cameras, then back at me. Her jaw tightened, but she signaled for her people to pack it up. The county officer gave me a polite nod before heading back to his truck. Within minutes the driveway was clear again. I went inside, but my heart was still pounding. This was not just about an office anymore. This was about someone trying to strip away my rights as a property owner. And I knew if I did not push back hard she would keep coming. Tom confirmed it when I called him later that night. He told me to be ready for the next stage. And the next stage was always the paperwork assault. Sure enough, Monday morning I found a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA. A long page of official-sounding language claiming I was in violation of community bylaws, section after section listed out with numbers and legal phrases. They demanded immediate compliance or they would take legal action. The problem for them was simple. I was not in their community. Those bylaws meant nothing to me. Still, I forwarded the letter to Tom, who said we would respond formally just to shut down any claim they might try to twist later. Over the next week I got 2 more letters, each more aggressive than the last. Karen was clearly on a mission. But here is the thing about missions built on lies. They eventually fall apart when the truth keeps slamming the door in their face. And I was more than ready to be that door. One night as the sun was going down I sat out on the porch with a cup of coffee. The ranch was quiet again. The field stretched out like a golden ocean in the fading light. I thought about all the years I spent building this place. All the long days and longer nights. The sweat, the dirt, the sheer stubborn will it took to make it mine. And I made a promise to myself right there. No matter what tricks Karen pulled. No matter how many letters she sent. No matter how many times she called 911. I was not giving up this land or that office. Not now. Not ever. But I had no idea that her next move would not be another letter. It would be something far bigger. Something that would drag in more than just county officers. It would bring back the police. And this time they would not just be here to talk. It was a Thursday morning when the storm rolled in. Not the kind with rain and thunder. This was the kind where trouble shows up in plain clothes with badges on their belts and serious looks on their faces. I was in the barn checking feed inventory when I heard the sound of multiple engines coming up the drive. Not just 1 or 2. This was at least half a dozen vehicles. I walked outside and saw 3 patrol cars, a county truck, and 2 of those HOA SUVs pulling in like they owned the place. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. Karen was back. And she was walking with the same stiff-backed posture of someone who thought the game was already won. Beside her was a tall man in a dark jacket with sheriff written in yellow across the back. He carried a folder under one arm and walked with the slow, steady pace of someone who had authority and knew it. I stepped forward and asked what this was about. The sheriff introduced himself and explained they had received a formal complaint of illegal occupancy and unauthorized business operations on the property. I almost laughed out loud at the absurdity of it, but then he said something that made my stomach drop. He told me they had a court order to conduct a search of the office building. That was Karen's move. She had found a judge willing to sign off based on whatever story she had spun. I kept my voice steady, but inside I was boiling. I told the sheriff I would comply because I had nothing to hide, but I wanted it on record that the complaint was false and I was not under any HOA jurisdiction. He nodded and told one of his deputies to begin recording the interaction on body cam. We walked toward the office with Karen trailing behind like a shadow. She had that smug smile again. The one that said she thought she had me cornered. Inside the office the deputies moved methodically. Opening cabinets, checking storage rooms, even looking inside the supply closet. One of them asked about the filing cabinets against the back wall. I explained they contained ranch records, invoices, contracts, and maintenance logs. Nothing more, nothing less. The sheriff flipped through a few files and then set them back exactly where they were. Karen kept hovering near the door, pretending to be involved in the process but never actually touching anything. When the deputies finished, the sheriff stepped outside with me to talk. He told me there was no evidence of illegal occupancy. No unapproved business operations. No code violations. The court order had been satisfied and they were done here. Karen's face when she heard that was worth framing. Her mouth tightened and her eyes darted like she was trying to find another angle on the spot. But the sheriff was clear. He told her in front of everyone that any further false complaints could result in charges for misuse of emergency services. She started to argue, but he cut her off with a look that could have frozen the sun. The HOA group shuffled back to their SUVs, and within minutes the driveway was empty again except for me and the wind. I went back inside and sat at my desk. For a moment the silence felt heavy, like the walls were absorbing the tension from what just happened. Then the phone rang. It was Tom, my lawyer. He had already heard about the visit from a contact at the courthouse. He told me this was a sign that Karen was getting desperate. When people start throwing around legal tools without evidence, it means they are running out of cards to play. But he also warned me that desperation can make someone more dangerous. She might try to drag me into civil court next just to burn my time and money. We decided to take the fight to her for a change. Tom drafted a cease and desist letter citing harassment, trespassing, and defamation. We sent it to the HOA board with a deadline for them to back off or face legal action. I felt a sense of control again for the first time in weeks. But I also knew Karen. She was the kind of person who would see a letter like that not as a warning but as a challenge. Sure enough, 2 days later I spotted her SUV parked on the shoulder just outside my property line. She sat there for over an hour doing nothing, just watching. I made sure the cameras caught the whole thing. It was the kind of behavior that told me she was not thinking about rules anymore. She was thinking about revenge. That weekend I kept busy with ranch work. Fixing a section of fence. Checking the well pump. Feeding the livestock. I tried to focus on the land and the things that mattered. But the thought of Karen sitting out there watching made every moment feel like I was being timed. By Sunday night I decided I was going to make the next move before she did. On Monday morning I drove into town and walked into the county records office. I asked for every document related to my property. Lot maps, boundary surveys, past inspections, tax records, the whole package. I wanted more than just the deeds I already had. I wanted a wall of proof that no one could dispute. The clerk was helpful, and after an hour of printing and signing I walked out with a folder so thick it barely fit in my bag. Back at the ranch I spread the documents across the desk and studied every line. The boundaries were clear. The office building sat entirely within my privately owned land. There was no overlap, no easement, no shared jurisdiction. It was mine outright and had been for years. If Karen wanted to claim otherwise, she would have to argue against the county's own certified maps. That was a fight I was ready for. That afternoon I called Tom again and told him what I had gathered. He was impressed. He said with this much documentation we could not only defend against any new claim but possibly countersue for damages. The thought of turning the tables lit a fire in me. I had spent weeks reacting to her. Now it was time to make her react to me. But before we could file anything, the next twist came. And it came faster than I expected. Late Tuesday afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I heard the sound of a helicopter overhead. At first I thought it was a news crew or maybe a medical chopper heading to the highway. But then I noticed it was circling, low and slow, right over my ranch. I stepped outside, shading my eyes. It was a small 2-seat helicopter with a camera mounted under the nose. It hovered for a while, then banked toward the north field and circled again. I realized what this was. Karen had hired someone to film my property from the air. Probably to find something, anything she could twist into a new complaint. I stood there watching the machine buzz across the sky like an angry insect. And in that moment I knew. This was no longer about an office or even about property lines. This was about control. About one person trying to prove she could break me. But she had picked the wrong man for that fight. The helicopter incident lit a fire under me. I knew Karen was pushing the limits of what was legal, and she was doing it in plain view. I spent the next morning reviewing the footage from my cameras. They had caught every second of the chopper circling overhead. The zoom lens captured its tail number clear as day. I sent it straight to Tom. He called me back an hour later, sounding both amused and annoyed. He told me that while flying over private land was legal in most cases, using aircraft for harassment could be considered stalking under state law. And with the tail number we could trace exactly who had chartered that flight. 2 days later Tom had his answer. The flight had been booked by a private security company in town. And the client listed on the invoice was none other than Karen herself. That was the final straw for me. I was done waiting for her to make the next move. It was time to go on the offensive. Tom filed a formal harassment complaint with the county sheriff's office. We included the helicopter footage, the SUV surveillance, the trespassing videos, and copies of every false letter she had sent. The deputy who took the report was professional, but I could see him shaking his head as he read through the stack. He told me off the record that they had dealt with Karen before. Apparently I was not her first target. But I might be the first one to push back this hard. While the complaint was processing, I kept running the ranch like normal. I woke up before sunrise, fed the cattle, fixed a broken gate in the west pasture, and checked the irrigation lines. Life on the ranch has a rhythm. And sticking to that rhythm helped keep my head clear while the legal wheels turned. But even with my focus on work, I could feel the tension in the air. The kind of tension you get before a summer storm when the clouds hang heavy and the wind goes still. One afternoon I was hauling hay bales to the barn when I saw movement near the tree line at the edge of my property. At first I thought it was a deer, but then I saw the glint of sunlight off a camera lens. It was one of Karen's people again. They were crouched low, snapping pictures through the trees. I parked the truck and walked toward them without saying a word. They must have seen me coming because they bolted before I got close. I didn't chase them. The cameras on that side of the property had already caught everything. It was more evidence for the case we were building. That night I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was painted in deep reds and golds. I thought about my father and how he had always told me land is worth more than gold because they are not making any more of it. He had worked his whole life to keep what little land he had. Now here I was decades later fighting to keep mine from someone who thought a boundary line on a fake HOA map gave her power. I swore to myself that I would see this through no matter how long it took. The next week Tom called with news. The sheriff's office had finished reviewing our harassment complaint and they were forwarding it to the district attorney. If the DA agreed, we could be looking at criminal charges against Karen. That was good news, but it also meant she would know we had gone after her. And sure enough, 2 days later she made her next move. I was in the middle of repairing a fence post when I heard the rumble of engines. 4 HOA SUVs pulled into the driveway, followed by a moving truck. I walked up to meet them and saw Karen step out with a stack of papers in her hand. She announced loudly that they were here to seize the office building under Emergency Community Authority. She actually used those words. Emergency Community Authority. I almost laughed in her face, but I kept my tone even and asked to see the papers. They were a joke. A stack of HOA bylaws printed off their website with a fake-looking notice claiming immediate possession due to ongoing violations. No court stamp, no county seal, nothing official. I told her flat out that she was trespassing and that if they touched a single item on my property I would have them arrested. She smirked and said she had already called the police to supervise the seizure. 15 minutes later, the same deputy who had taken my harassment report pulled up. He took one look at the situation and told Karen to step aside. When she argued, he told her she was interfering with an active investigation and warned her she could be detained. I saw the flash of panic in her eyes before she turned and stomped back to her SUV. The moving truck backed out and the rest of her group followed. After they were gone, the deputy told me something that made me realize just how far she had fallen. He said she had tried to convince the dispatcher that I was running a criminal operation out of the office. No evidence, just wild accusations. He told me she was digging herself into a hole and that if she kept going it was only a matter of time before she faced serious charges. I spent the rest of that day in the office going through files and making sure everything was backed up. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but it was going to be on my terms. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about protecting my land anymore. It was about making sure people like her understood they couldn't bully their way into control. 2 days later, Tom called again. The DA had agreed to take the harassment case. We were officially moving forward. And that meant Karen was about to find herself in a courtroom instead of my driveway. I didn't know it yet, but the day of that first hearing would change everything. Because when the judge heard the full story and saw the evidence, the power dynamic between me and Karen would flip completely. And for the first time since this started, I would see her lose control in front of everyone. The morning of the first hearing was cool and still. A thin mist clung to the edges of the fields as I left the ranch and drove into town. I had been in courtrooms before for land deals and zoning hearings, but this felt different. This was personal. This was about my name, my property, and the principle of standing up to someone who thought rules only applied to other people. Tom met me on the courthouse steps holding a leather folder so thick it looked like it could stop a bullet. Inside was every piece of evidence we had collected. Video footage from the cameras. Printouts of Karen's letters. Screenshots of her SUV parked on the shoulder. And of course the helicopter photos complete with the invoice linking it to her. Tom had arranged everything in chronological order so the judge could see the full pattern of harassment. We walked into the courtroom and I spotted Karen right away. She was sitting at the plaintiff's table even though she wasn't the one being sued. She had her arms crossed and that same smug look like she thought this was going to end in her favor. Beside her sat a man I assumed was her lawyer. He looked uncomfortable, like he already knew what was coming but was too far in to back out now. When the judge entered, we all stood then sat again as the proceedings began. Tom spoke first, laying out the timeline of events. He didn't use big dramatic words. He just told the story as it had happened step by step. The judge listened quietly, occasionally glancing at the stack of documents in front of him. When Tom was done, he began presenting the video clips. We watched on the large courtroom monitor as Karen's SUVs rolled into my driveway. We saw her walking around my office taking pictures without permission. We saw her sitting in her SUV for over an hour watching my property. Then came the helicopter footage. Clear and undeniable. Karen shifted in her seat when the invoice with her name on it appeared on screen. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she shook her head and kept staring straight ahead. The judge's expression didn't change, but I could tell he was taking it all in. When it was their turn to speak, Karen's lawyer tried to frame it all as due diligence. He claimed she was acting on behalf of concerned residents. That the helicopter was for aerial mapping. That the visits were simply attempts to discuss compliance issues. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked the one question that cut through the entire defense. He said, "If the property is not part of your HOA, why would you have any compliance issues to discuss?" The lawyer hesitated just long enough for the silence to feel heavy. Then he admitted they believed the property fell within a disputed boundary. That was when Tom slid the certified county maps across the table. Maps that showed in clear bold lines that my land was entirely outside their jurisdiction. The judge looked them over, then looked back at Karen's side. He asked if they had any official document from the county to contradict these maps. They did not. From that point it was all downhill for them. Tom finished by pointing out that every action they had taken, from the uninvited visits to the helicopter, had been done without any legal authority and in direct violation of my rights as a property owner. He requested a restraining order against Karen and any HOA member from entering or surveilling my property. He also requested that the court refer the harassment case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges. The judge leaned back in his chair for a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was calm but firm. He said the evidence was clear. The property was not under the HOA. Karen's actions constituted harassment and trespassing. The restraining order was granted effective immediately, and the harassment case would indeed be referred to the district attorney. Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but her lawyer put a hand on her arm and shook his head. The bailiff handed me a copy of the order right there in the courtroom. It stated in plain language that Karen and anyone acting on her behalf was prohibited from coming within 200 yards of my property for the next 2 years. Walking out of that courthouse felt like stepping into fresh air after weeks in a smoke-filled room. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt like I had won a real battle. But Tom reminded me it wasn't over yet. The restraining order was one thing. The criminal case was another. And he expected Karen to find ways to test the limits of the order just to see what she could get away with. Sure enough, it only took a week for her to make her next move. One evening just before sunset, I spotted a drone hovering over the north field. It wasn't one of mine. The thing had a high-resolution camera dangling underneath, and it was moving slow like it was filming. I pulled out my phone and recorded it until it flew off toward the subdivision. Tom contacted the sheriff with the footage, and they confirmed it would be added to the growing file against her. I realized then that some people can't accept losing. Karen had been told by a judge in front of witnesses that she had no authority over me. Yet here she was still trying to find a way to impose herself on my land. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about ego. About proving she could win even after she had lost. That kind of mindset is dangerous. Because it means the other person doesn't care about consequences until those consequences are staring them right in the face. And I had a feeling that day was coming sooner than she expected. The district attorney's office contacted me a month later. They were moving forward with formal harassment charges. They wanted me to testify. I agreed without hesitation. If telling my story in court meant stopping her from doing this to someone else, it was worth every minute. What I didn't know then was that my testimony would end up being more than just words on a stand. It would become the turning point that not only protected my property once and for all, but also exposed something about Karen that no one in that courtroom was ready to hear. The day of the criminal trial arrived with a cold wind that rattled the barn doors before sunrise. I woke up early, fed the cattle, and double-checked that all the cameras around the property were working. Even though the restraining order was still in effect, I half expected Karen to make some kind of last-minute stunt. But the driveway stayed empty, so I put on a clean shirt, grabbed the thick folder of evidence, and headed for town. When I arrived at the courthouse, the district attorney's assistant met me in the lobby. She was a sharp young woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She walked me through the order of the hearing and told me they were confident in the case. The harassment charges were backed by months of documented proof. Video letters, maps, audio recordings, and even witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen parked outside my property more than once. Inside the courtroom, Karen sat at the defense table this time. She didn't have the same smug look I'd seen before. Instead, she looked tense, almost cornered. Her lawyer avoided eye contact with me entirely, which told me he knew this wasn't going to go their way. The DA started the case with a clear timeline of events. They laid out the first visit from the HOA, the false 911 call, the code enforcement attempt, the helicopter flight, the moving truck stunt, the drone footage. Each point was supported with photos and video. The courtroom monitor played clip after clip showing Karen overstepping the line again and again. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand and swore the oath. I told the court exactly what had happened from the moment I saw those first HOA SUVs in my driveway to the day the restraining order was issued. I spoke slowly, clearly, making sure every detail landed. The judge listened without interrupting while the DA guided me through the events. At one point they played the body cam footage from the sheriff's visit where the deputy told Karen she had no authority. You could see the frustration on her face even back then. When the DA was finished, Karen's lawyer tried to cross-examine. He asked if I had ever considered working with the HOA to resolve the matter peacefully. I told him I had considered it right up until the moment they trespassed on my property without permission and lied to law enforcement. He didn't have much to say after that. Then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. During the DA's final segment, they introduced new evidence. It was a set of emails obtained through a subpoena. Emails from Karen to the rest of the HOA board. In them she openly admitted that my property was outside their jurisdiction. But she wrote that she planned to push until I gave in because once she got control of my office she could leverage it for future development deals. The courtroom went silent. Karen's lawyer froze in his seat. The judge leaned forward and read one of the lines out loud. Said, "He doesn't realize how much trouble I can make for him if I keep calling the cops." That was the nail in the coffin. The DA rested their case and the judge announced a short recess before delivering the verdict. Karen sat stiff in her chair, staring straight ahead. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. When court resumed, the judge spoke in a tone that left no room for doubt. He found her guilty of harassment and misuse of emergency services. She was sentenced to community service fines and a mandatory no-contact order extending beyond the restraining order already in place. The judge also warned her that any further violation would result in immediate jail time. Walking out of that courtroom felt different this time. It wasn't just relief. It was closure. The weight that had been pressing on me for months was gone. I knew she couldn't come near my land, my office, or my life without risking her freedom. Back at the ranch, the evening sun was spilling gold across the fields. I stood on the porch of the office building and looked out over everything I had fought to protect. The barns, the fences, the open land stretching to the horizon. Was mine. Every square foot of it. And no one, not an HOA, not a false authority, not even a determined troublemaker like Karen, was going to take it away. Over the next few weeks I settled back into the rhythm of ranch life. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and the fields needed care. But now I worked with a peace of mind I hadn't felt in months. The camera stayed up. The documents stayed in the safe. And every so often I'd glance at the driveway knowing it would stay empty of those HOA SUVs. Some battles you win quietly and some you win in front of a room full of people. This one had been both. I had stood my ground, taken every hit she threw at me, and walked away not just with my property intact but with the truth laid out for everyone to see. And that truth was simple. You don't mess with a man's land unless you're ready to lose more than you bargained for. Thanks for watching this story till the end. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments.